All right, so welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick off our second in our series of thinning meetings. So today we're going to hear from Terrence about his recommendations for the 10 to 12 millimeter timing. Before we do, I'll just give another little update of what I saw. I made it down into Saratoga County this morning, so just wanted to report on what I was seeing. Depending on the orchard and the variety, I'd say set's looking variable. In one of the orchards that I visited, I think set's looking really, really good. Honeycrisp, Gala, Fuji, Max, Snaps, really all the varieties that I was looking at had a lot of kings that are growing and a lot of laterals that look like they're holding on pretty strong. So I was seeing a lot of kings with 3, 4 laterals still hanging despite bloom and petal fall applications that were made on those varieties. At another orchard that I visited down the road, there the Gala and the Max look like they're holding pretty well, 2, 3 laterals along with some healthy kings, while Honeycrisp and Fuji look like they didn't set quite as well. On that particular orchard, no thinners have been applied at this point, but some of the laterals are coming off, so looks like their set wasn't in quite as well as the other orchard. So something to keep in mind, certainly orchard to orchard, something to be contending with. So certainly going out and assessing what you have is certainly going to be crucial this year. Size is really spread out. Again, depending on orchard and the variety, I think that certainly plays hand in hand with the extended bloom period that we saw. So depending on where things were at and when they bloom, we're seeing that lag in size. So when I was measuring today in southern Saratoga, I was seeing Max. Those kings were 10, 11 millimeter in size. You'd see a 12 here and there as well. Honeycrisp also similarly, a little bit more spread out. There I was seeing kings between 8 and up to 11s. And Fuji and Gala mostly hovering in the 8 to 9 range. Snaps quite a bit further behind, as we talked about last week, where a lot of the snaps were still in full bloom. This week, the ones I was looking at still about 6 to 8 millimeters on the kings. And certainly this was in southern Saratoga, so as we move north and west of there, I think we're going to be a bit further behind even than some. So I do want to talk a little bit about the precision thinning with the fruit growth rate model that we've been following at a site on Honeycrisp in Saratoga County. So just to give you a little bit of background, you can see the block here. I believe it's planted at 2 by 11. And the applications that it received so far, 10 parts NAA at bloom, and then at petal fall, another 10 parts of NAA along with 2 pints of 7. And so earlier this week, and again this morning, my technician Natasha went out and measured the fruitlets on 15 clusters on 5 trees. And so we punched that into the fruit growth rate model. And you can see over to the left here, we started with a potential of 450 fruit per tree. I believe these trees were averaging between 80 to 100 clusters per tree when we started out. And so you can see this is what we currently have after the measurements today. So we're still at 329 fruits per tree. So looking at this indicates to us that despite the bloom and petal fall thinning that we've done, there is still a considerable amount on these trees, and we really only took off a relatively small percentage with those 2 early sprays that we've done so far. So certainly something to keep in mind going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Robinson, and he'll give us his recommendations for thinning at the 10 to 12 millimeter stage.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you see that, Mike? Is that?
Yep, just go ahead and put in full screen and we should be all set. Yep, looks good. Thanks.
Well, great. Today we're going to talk about the main thinning spray of the season, which is the 10 to 13 millimeter spray. We will heavily rely on the carbon balance model in making our decisions. But it is really, really helpful to have had data from the fruit growth rate model to help guide us. So Mike just presented some wonderful data for one variety, which indicates modest or very little thinning on Honeycrisp from both a blossom and a petal fall spray, and therefore we're really going to need effective thinning and at this timing to achieve our goal. I want to also emphasize that I expect this spray to work very well, but it may not. And so measuring fruits again after this spray will also help either confirm that we got the thinning we needed or alert us that we need to thin again. So my summary follows right along with Mike so far. There's variable set. There's some places where there was frost. The cool weather through bloom appears to have affected set in some places. That's a challenging situation to give blanket recommendations. So I would just really emphasize that you need to assess your block carefully. And two things that I try to assess are the kings present or not. And then secondly, how many laterals are there on the tree? Now the data that Mike just presented with Honeycrisp, where 450 was the initial flower number, and they still had 329. Just rough calculation, that means that they still have 4 fruits in a cluster that are growing instead of the 5. So in essence, they still got a lot of thinning to do because they didn't really get very much out of those other 2 sprays. Well, that's kind of what we worried about. It was cool conditions at petal fall, the carbohydrate surplus, and this probably gave very mild thinning. A couple of days ago when we had the Hudson Valley meeting, Dan Donahue had measured some blocks in lower Ulster County, and they had pretty reasonable thinning from the petal fall and the bloom sprays. But it appears from the measurements Mike's made that that didn't happen in the capital region. The good news is that this spray, the 10 to 13 millimeter spray, is going to go under much warmer conditions and will likely give great thinning. Now, we're going to talk about some carbohydrate deficits, but I don't want anybody to get too worried because that's going to help us a ton to get the proper thinning. We suggest again that you use the degree day calculator that's within the carbon balance model to time the spray for this 10 to 13 millimeters. And over many years, what seems to have given the best thinning is between 200 and 250 degree days. When you look at that for Clifton Park, this is just a specific place in the capital region. This is what the chart looks like. I just ran it a few minutes ago. And if you look at bloom, which is way back on April the 30th, we had some mild deficits, but it quickly turned positive through bloom because it was cold and fruits and flowers were developing very slow and didn't need very much carbon. Thus, there was a surplus of carbon. And when we got to petal fall, depending on whether you sprayed in the early part or near the end of that, there was substantial surplus of carbon in the tree and negates the effect of the thinner. Interestingly enough, as temperatures warmed up, these deficits began to grow in size of their negative number. And it appears that they have reached a maximum negative value on the 19th, which was yesterday. And now it's tending to turn up a little bit. As far as we can predict, which is only a couple more days, it doesn't go back up to 0 with a surplus, but it stays somewhere in a more modest negative value. We're just now entering the window for the 10 to 13 millimeter range based on degree days. So when you look at the bottom part of the chart, I want to point out a number of things I hope that you'll look at when you run it for your farm. Earlier, the color of all these cells was a very light blue, and the scale is up here, meaning we can expect very mild thinning. And if you look at the petal fall timing, it had all blue in the cells, indicating we expected only mild thinning. There were a few days as it began to warm up, those cells were green back up a few days ago, but starting on the 18th, they all now this orange pink color, which means thinning should be very good. So that tells us we've got tremendous opportunity here during the next few days. The second thing I want you to notice in this next to the last column, which is the degree day accumulator, we start to highlight the cells between 200 and 250. So they have a black box around them. That's the optimum thinning window. And it basically starts today. We're very just dang close by the end of today to 200. And it goes to about Monday, just past 250 on Monday. So there's a 5-day window here where thinning will probably be very good. Now, I don't have the average for the last 2 days of those 5 because the forecast we are working with only goes out 5 days, and therefore we can't really calculate the average until we have one more day of data. It's interesting that the average has gone from -30 to -42, -40, and now it's moderating back up to -27. That's because there was a couple of really hot days still coming up on the 22nd, which will give a tremendous deficit, but then more moderate days. And as you look forward into early next week, temperatures are in the mid 70s, mid to low 70s, and the deficits are either close to zero or slightly positive. And when you average that, that starts to give this upward trend to the line. And I predict it will probably go close to zero over the days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week. That tells me we need to take advantage of this period of time where we've got some reasonable deficits to thin. If you wait until Tuesday, it's likely that the deficits will be much milder or non-existent, and you won't get as much thinning. The last thing I want to point out on this chart is the recommendation. Now, it's not quite as safe as it was before, because in this column, I use this little scale here about what is your risk? What's the downside of thinning? And there's been very little risk up until yesterday and today. But there is a little risk yesterday and today, and so I put this yellow caution. Now, if it ever has a red circle, that's really dangerous, and I probably would avoid thinning during those periods. But at the moment, good thinning with some small risk. So how do we put that all together? I really think that the carbohydrate model is extremely valuable when we're trying to time these sprays and decide when to spray and how much to spray. So I just want to repeat that there are 3 places you can access the carbohydrate model. One is on the NUA website. There's also the new version of that, which is essentially the same, but a little fancier looking. Then there's the MaluSim website. And then there's the MaluSim phone app. The phone app version is slightly different in 2021 than it was in 2020. And so I encourage you to trash your old version and download the new version from the App Store. There are a couple of basic rules that I would like to emphasize about the carbohydrate model. One is that whenever you see deficits that are really negative, -60 or even lower than that, it's very dangerous to thin. And we would suggest that you not thin during those periods, just wait it out and thin when the conditions moderate. The second point is that the carbohydrate model has shown us over the years that thinners have their strongest effect when fruits are between 10 and 13 millimeters, and that's generally between the 200 and 250 degree days. So that's good and bad. On the good side, thinners are going to work. There should be a strong effect, and they should be very effective. But if you've already got light set or problems, it also can be risky. I think that the risk right now is not that great. There is a little risk, but I'm hesitant to talk about it too much that it will make you afraid to spray. So the model indicates that there will be significant deficits to help achieve good thinning, but the deficits are not so large that we should avoid thinning. And I think my final message on that point is that you can't avoid thinning. This is a perfect time to thin and take advantage of the deficits you have. So it looks like the best timing starts today. Now, fruit sizes, like Mike pointed out with Max, they're up there at 10, but on many other varieties, they're way behind. So the model has to be run separately for varieties that may have bloomed later. And one of the things we have not done with the model is had a specific degree day number for each variety. And this year's taught us that varieties respond very differently. Max seemed to chug right through the cool weather, and surprisingly, so did Fuji. But Honeycrisp and Gala sort of were stopped in their tracks during the cold weather, and they didn't progress, and now are behind those other varieties. And Snapdragon's even worse. It seems to have lagged behind almost everything else. So if those varieties are not yet at the 10 millimeter, then you want to wait a little bit. But for Max and for other varieties that are now at 10 millimeters, this 5-day window starts today and ends on Monday. Any of those 5 days, I think, will give very good thinning. Probably as you get into Tuesday, Wednesday, the thinning will be less good. So if you're working with a variety that's still not at 10 millimeters, I probably would go ahead on Monday, even if it's just barely getting close to 10 millimeters, rather than wait till Tuesday or Wednesday. So during that period of time, the high temperatures are going to be in the 80s. There's a one day that's going to be substantially higher than 80, in the mid 80s. The others are a little bit lower. The average carbohydrate balance, and this is a 7-day average, is still between 30 and 20. And that gives strong thinning, but not excessive thinning. Once we get less negative than minus 20 or minus 10 or minus 5, it's just not enough deficit. With that level of deficit, especially today and tomorrow, the model is going to ask and suggest that you put on slightly less than full rates, just a small reduction in rate of 15%. I'm going to stick with that because I think there is a small risk. And that would be all I would do, is reduce rates a little bit. Now, one note is that this is a perfect year for Maxell, and where Maxell really shines is with small fruited varieties with Gala. It also works really well on Fuji, even though it's not so small fruited because we don't like NAA. Works great on Snapdragons and many other varieties, but because of the warm temperatures, it should do a fabulous job this year. So this is the year to use that product. I think that this particular spray, if you get it on today, tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, is going to do all the thinning that we need. And we won't need to worry about additional rescue sprays into next week. But the only real way to really assess that is with the fruit growth rate model. Now, let me come back to this chart from the carbohydrate model and just look forward. So we're looking at this window that started today. Basically by the end of the day, we'll have gotten to 200, and then goes forward till the 23rd, which is Monday. But then we're going to continue with relatively warm temperatures, and we're going to get almost to the 300 by the 26th, which is Wednesday. That means that the window for rescue thinning is going to open at 300 and will close at 350. So there's not going to be a lot of days in between this spray and a potential rescue spray. That is because the temperatures, and especially these nighttime temperatures in the 60s. Now, we have one tomorrow and one the day after, if they really happen, but also one down on May 26th. Those nighttime temperatures make thinners very aggressive, but they also stimulate a lot of fruit growth. So the only real way to really determine if you're going to be okay with this spray and you don't need to worry about another spray between 300 degree days and 350 is to get those fruit measurements taken. As far as thinning options at the 10 to 13 millimeters, we have basically almost all of our tools that are available. This time we can use Carbaryl. The combinations have worked the best over the years. A lot of people in Pennsylvania use 7 in oil. We don't use that too much in New York because the oil is problematic in and around Captan. To spray this oil with 7, you have to not use Captan for 7 days before or 7 days after. And most people start switching to using Captan after the bloom for the first cover, and so it makes it problematic. Much more common are the combinations of either NAA and 7 or Maxell and 7. And as I mentioned in our last meeting, for those of you doing a carbaryl-free program, the combination of Maxell and NAA has worked great, almost as good as Maxell and 7 or NAA and 7. Specific varieties I'll comment on briefly. This is a great year to use Maxell on Gala. My suggested dose is 64 ounces per tree row volume dilute basis and a pint of carbaryl. I want to pause and re-explain what I mean by tree row volume dilute basis, just so there's no confusion. If your orchard is a very narrow, two-dimensional, tall spindle orchard and you've hedged it and it's just thin, two-dimensional, it might only measure 100 or 120 gallons for a dilute spray. Let's just say it measures 100. So for that orchard, you'd put 64 gallons per every 100 gallons and a pint for every 100 and spray it at 100 gallons, and you'd be essentially putting almost a dilute spray. But let's suppose you have a more three-dimensional tall spindle orchard or semi-dwarf trees that are more three-dimensional, and they measure at 200 gallons tree row volume. Now there's everything in between, but let's just use the 200 example. That means that you're spraying only 100 gallons, but your trees really are 200-gallon trees. So you need to have a concentration factor of 2. So in the case of Maxell, you would double that. And so you'd be putting in essentially 128 ounces, which is a gallon for every 100, because the trees need twice 64 and they have two, they really are 200-gallon trees. And so they're only getting half the water, but they need double that chemical. So in a lot of the cases in the past, on good years like this, we're putting on essentially a gallon of Maxell to the acre. But with more people really trying to narrow up canopies with hedging, and some of those trees don't measure 200 gallons anymore, you have to then really cut back on the amount of Maxell. If it was going to, you'd hedged it, and it was two-dimensional, and it was halfway in between 100 and 200, say 150-gallon tree row volume dilute, then you'd 1.5 times the 64 ounces to get the proper dose per acre. Now, let's go on to Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp is best thinned with NAA. Maxell works well on Honeycrisp, but it sometimes is a little too aggressive. Plus, we'd love the NAA to help stimulate repeat bloom. But it takes a substantial dose of NAA, which is 3 ounces per 100 on a tree row volume dilute basis, just like I explained with the Gala, and a pint of carbaryl. With McIntosh, I like one of two options. The NAA option is a medium to low rate of only 2 ounces or 5 parts per million with a pint of carbaryl. But I also really like Maxell on McIntosh. It works beautifully at 48 ounces per 100. Yesterday, or a couple days ago, people were telling me the Empire set in the valley was variable because Empire seems to be sensitive to frost. Now, if it's the same in the capital region, then you have to use a lot of caution. But if you got a strong set of Empire, this Maxell rate of 64 ounces plus a pint of carbaryl does a fabulous job. It thins wonderfully, but it also boosts the size of Empire if you're looking for large size Empire. For Spur-Delicious, I didn't hear anybody talk about Spur-Delicious fruit set. In Western New York, we've got tremendous bloom and set of Spur-Delicious. And in that case, you've got to use the more aggressive rate of Maxell of 64 ounces with a pint of carbaryl. I don't like to put NA on Spur-Delicious because I get pygmy fruit. It's made worse if you use Provolone or you use Maxell, but I still don't like it even if they weren't used. The same goes for Fuji. So both Spur-Delicious and Fuji are best thinned with Maxell at 64 ounces on a tree row volume basis. Now we can talk about other varieties at the end if you would like, but I just put down a few there to give some examples. That's my recommendations for thinning. In the next 5 days, go out. Any of the days will be good. Don't wait too long. Don't wait till Tuesday. And then after you spray, you've got to figure out how good that spray worked by measuring some fruits, measuring their fruitlet diameters. So that's pretty easy to do. If we go back up to this chart right here, suppose you did spray today. Well, let's put it, you sprayed tomorrow on the 21st at 214 degree days. You'd add 50 to that until 264 would be the day you would measure. That's May the 24th. And that's Monday. You take your first measurement there. And then since you sprayed at 214, the second measurement's 120 days after that, which would be 334. We don't quite have that on the chart yet, but it looks like that would be Thursday, probably, of next week. And then you'd have the answer to then decide if you wanted to spray anything again on Thursday or Friday of next week. So I hope that many of you will do that. Communicate with Mike if you're willing, or you are going to do that, and he and I can look at your data and help interpret it. One last comment. The new version of the phone app and the web version of the fruit growth rate model at Malusim both have the new error detection protocols. So I really encourage you to do that. Once again, delete your old version of Malusim on your phone, download the new version, and then input your fruit growth measurements into there on 2 dates, 50 degree days after this spray and 120. And it'll automatically give you the answer, how many fruits you still have growing relative to your target. And it will find all the errors so that the answer can be much more dependable and reliable. That's all I really want to present. I'll just spend a minute here summarizing it. I wish there was a more uniform set, but the variability in set really demands that you assess each block and each variety. Generally, I like to look if the kings are present, but even if they're not, I still thin, but with a slightly lower rate, because you cannot be afraid to thin, because you can have a huge crop of lateral flowers, fruits. But if most of the kings are present, then you basically got to use full rates. But if it's in the next 1 or 2 days, you'd want to reduce a little bit the rate by 15%. The timing of it is best in between 200 and 250. That's sometime in today or the next 4 days. But assessing response will help us determine whether you have to come back with a rescue spray at 300 to 350 degree days. Now, 2 or 3 little suggestions. We have a new recommendation on how to nozzle your sprayer from here forward. Let me review what we've said about the other sprays. For the bloom sprays, the nozzling should be uniform from top to bottom, because you basically have to get ATS or NAA on every single flower. For the petal fall spray, however, we like the traditional nozzling of 2/3 in the top and 1/3 in the bottom. But a number of studies I did and then Pollyanna repeated showed that for the 10 millimeter spray that we're focusing on now, even that spray pattern gives us too much thinning in the bottom. So we like to re-nozzle with 3/4 of the spray in the top half of the tree and only 1/4 directed to the bottom half of the tree. Now, because of the variability in fruit set, it's important to look on whether you have the same fruit set in the bottom versus the top. If there is some frost damage, another suggestion is don't put any thinner on the bottom half. They will thin enough on their own. So just shut off the bottom nozzles if you're doing blocks that had some frost damage. Now, suggestions number 5 and 6 are, because of the heat this year and the pretty nice carbohydrate deficits in the -30 range, Regulate would probably result in a risk of overthinning. So I would like to not include any Regulate in this thinning sprays. And lastly, don't put oil in either. If we need to come back later with a follow-up rescue spray at 18 millimeters, then we'll put oil in there, because that is the only way to get thinning at that time. just another plea to measure some fruits and tell me if you did, and I'll look at the data and help interpret it. With that, I'll stop and be happy to talk about any comment or any questions or have some discussion on other ideas.
All right, great. Thank you, Terrence. So we do have a couple things in the chat box that I'd just like to draw people's attention to. I did go ahead and put the links for both the Malusim app and also the carbohydrate model through NUA. Let me just find the chat box here. Then we did also have a question from Mo about if you got rid of the old Malusim app and got the new one and still weren't able to get in. I did make the recommendation. It usually will keep your account, so you probably would need to re-sign in with the same email. So what I've done is I just went on to the actual website, and you can find the password reset option. And if you're like me, I have about 6 different passwords that I kind of rotate between. Probably shouldn't be admitting that, but you can re-enter your password and then you should be good to go again. So if anybody has any issues there, please let us know.
Am I unmuted yet?
Yes, you are.
Good. Okay. Well, I have several email addresses also, and a couple of times have done what was suggested. And if what I am using is the new Malusim, it ain't much better than the old Malusim. The voice recognition is horrible. Maybe 75% of the time, but probably closer to 50 to 60% of the time does it accept my input, which means I have to stop, pick up the unit, maybe erase what it mistakenly entered for a value and retype it. And I mean, Andy and I have been at it for hours and hours and hours, and we finally, frankly, after we somehow managed to also delete what we did manage to get in there. There are easy ways to delete your entries without ever touching where it says clear measurements or something like that. I wouldn't dare say clear measurements because it probably wouldn't ask me if I was sure I wanted to clear the measurement. But it's been really, really, Terrence, I can't tell you how frustrating it's been.
Other than that, it's great, isn't it?
Other than that, it's been great. Like, you sound like the discussion I had with that. What was the Secretary of Agriculture that had visit up here? And after I blasted him on the crop insurance and everything else, he said, well, is there anything good we do? But it really, but I mean, if I have the new voice recognition is not functioning adequately to be worth our time, and frankly, the amount of time that it's taking us to enter the data for 5 trees, which is over an hour, I think is better spent by just sitting on my gator and calibrating my eyes and looking at what's going on in the orchard. And so I'm just really frustrated at this point that I'm feeling like I'm not getting any value. I'll try this. You know, you didn't mention, Terrence, that if we trash the old one, that we should then look for the place where it says reset password, because I trashed the old one and then I go in and I try to sign up and it says, well, that email address has already been taken. So I try another email address. That email address has already been taken. And so all I can do is sign in on the old account. And I don't, from the looks of it, I can't tell if I'm on the old Malusim or the new Malusim.
No, if you sign in into your old account, you're running the new version. So just sign in into your old account and you'll be.
Well, then then I don't see it being much better than the old one, to be honest.
Okay, yeah. So I'll comment. The voice recognition part has been very frustrating.
Yes.
John Clements is the only one that can really make it work.
Well, we just had a vote about that too, about 10 minutes ago.
So I tried really hard to get our programmers to find a different voice recognition, but they just were unable to get it to really work any better.
Well, thank you. At least John can't tell me that it's just me.
No, it's not. But maybe I'll take that off. I don't know, but I leave it on there because John seems to like it. But the thing that's better are the error detection protocols. So enter your data by hand, but still run the fruit growth rate model on Malusim because it will find errors that you made. The errors that it finds is if you measured a fruit on day one, the first one and the second one, and it grew bigger than, for some reason, it was measured wrong. It grew much more than is physically possible than we ever see. It'll pick that up and delete that one because that particular error is very common. And what it means is that it ups the average on that fruit growth rate model and makes people think a lot more thinned off than really has. So it detects that error. It also detects error when you had 4 fruits in a cluster last time, and now you want 5 fruits in the cluster. And so if you just use that, you'll get, I think, the right answer. If you happen to make no errors, there will be no difference, because that's really all we could get done this year. The speech recognition stayed essentially the same.
So the build date that's on the program is still 19.
They probably forgot to change that little thing, but the only thing that's available when you go to malusim.org is the new version.
Okay. It's really impossible to tell if you're on a new version or the old version.
And I'll have to tell them to go change that build date. They probably forgot to do that.
Okay, good.
Sorry for the frustration, Mo, but other than that, how are things?
We have a beautiful set, and we followed exactly what you've suggested. The only difference we have is we're expecting 89 degrees on Sunday. But if we did, I mean, I look at what your recommendation was, and we did the bloom with NAA at 10 parts. We did the petal fall with NAA at 4 ounces and 2 pints. But they still look like they're stuck on pretty good.
Did you say 89? Or
Yes,
did I mishear you?
89 what?
Degrees on Sunday.
89, yes.
Wow.
89.
That's
Yeah.
really.
It was a big topic of discussion at the Massachusetts meeting yesterday, when Dwayne suggested we go on with the regular rates. But we're asking, if we get 89, do we still want to go on with the standard rate?
He said, go for it.
He said, go for it, yes.
Well, I can't go against Dwayne. He's got more years than I've got.
Well, I know.
But the carb model is going to tell you, skip it, don't spray on that day.
Well, it's not picked it up yet.
It's not picking that up, though.
It really doesn't pick that forecast up?
I
Not
don't,
to Sunday, I think to Saturday so far.
Oh, okay, yeah. When it gets that 89 on Sunday, it'll respond.
all right. Well,
How far into the future does it look, Terrence? Is it 3 days forward or?
Well, it's 5 days forward, but
Okay.
the average can only go as far as that 5 days forward. So only get 2 days of the average. And that's primarily because of the model needs sunlight forecasts. And that's the most difficult thing to forecast. We had temperature, we could go 10 days out on temperature, but the forecasters haven't been able to give us any reliable sunlight estimates more than 5 days out.
So it doesn't have a rate guidance for Sunday yet.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be there tomorrow then. But so that also is important to note that if it's one day that's warm, it's not going to cause overthinning, because if it just a 1 day spike, we don't seem to get overthinning. But when you piece together 2 at least, and especially 3 days, that's when you get overthinning.
That's what happened last year.
Yeah. And that really came out of some studies that we did with Alan, that just one bad day doesn't cause overthinning, but piecing together at least 2, but definitely 3 days is where we get the problem.
Thank you.
So Mo, I got your other question here too. It sounds like you got some exceed and you'd like some suggestions on that.
I use it on peaches, and it thinned all of the peaches off of one variety, which eventually ended up self-thinning all of its peaches off anyhow. It was a mistake that the nursery sent me of a California variety. But frankly, we did about half an acre of peaches with it, and five trees at the ends of the rows, and I can't see any results from it.
That bloomed.
At bloom and at the highest rate. And I don't see any results from it. So now we're looking at, well, how do we use it in apples if we're going to use it? I'm assuming we'll use it as a rescue if we need to. Otherwise,
Well, that's really where it's targeted. I've just not done the peach work, so I can't really, I'm only doing apple work with the seed. And we're really targeting the 18 millimeter because we can even thin with that at 20 millimeters. So it's for years when we get in trouble and nothing works earlier, this will be a product to help a lot.
I'll just put it in the spray shed if I don't need it this year.
I don't think you will. I think
I hope not.
it will.
All right, I'll go ahead and open it up. If anybody has any other questions, feel free. You can type them into the chat box, or it's a pretty small group, so you're welcome to turn your microphone on and ask right off. Maybe while we wait for that, Terrence, I do have a quick question for you for the 7 and the tree row volume. Are you adjusting that based on tree row volume too, or just sticking with a pint per acre?
Just sticking with the pint per acre. I should have made that clear. The tree roll volume adjustment is for the Maxell or the NAA, but with these hot temperatures, I don't adjust the carbaryl amount for tree roll volume. It's strictly 1 pint per 100. Now, at the earlier timing, when it was so cool at pedal fall, I did go ahead and break my own rule and say, let's put in the 2 pints of carbaryl, even though, as I've mentioned many, many times before over the years, only 1 pint is soluble. And so that pint gets absorbed, or parts of that pint get absorbed. But the other pint that you put in the second pint is just being mixed in around, and it's deposited on the leaf as an insecticide and sits on the surface of the leaf, but doesn't do anything for thinning unless you get a little bit of re-wetting. And since temperatures were so cool, I said, let's just go ahead and put that extra amount on the leaf and see if we can get a little bit extra out of it, because there wasn't going to probably be much from that pedal fall thinning. But now I really don't want that extra amount on the leaf, because I think this spray is going to be very effective. And then I don't want more.
Okay, great.
Would come along.
And is that the same with the carbohydrate adjustments? Would you decrease it by 15 or increase it by, in this situation, decreasing it?
Yeah, probably not. I think that's mostly for the NAA and the Maxell. I probably should have made that point clear. Just keep the pint of carbaryl the same.
Okay, great.
It's interesting that the studies we've done with carbaryl show very little rate response, even when we take it below a pint. But when you take it above a pint, there's almost no rate response except when you get re-wetting. But decreasing rate doesn't seem to make much difference either.
Okay, good to know. Speaking of re-wetting, looking at the forecast, it looks like we're looking at the potential for some pop-up showers throughout some of that thinning window. I had a question come in a couple times now for NAA and Maxell. You know, if we're putting it on in the morning and we get pop-up showers, how much time do you need it to be dry for it to do its job?
The standard answer I say is 8 hours, but that's even just a simplification. It turns out that Dwayne, well, I should go give Dwayne the credit. He did this work many years ago, but NAA continues to be absorbed in the leaf for almost 24 hours after it's applied. Now, after that, it's degraded by the sun. So the initial 1 hour is when the rate of absorption is the highest, but it's still slowly absorbed over the whole next 24 hours. The same is with Maxell. Even though the leaf looks dry, there's still some absorption. So the problem comes in when 2 hours after you spray, you get rain. People always say, well, now what do I do? And it's hard to know. I've said in the past, if you get 8 hours of dry before the rain, you will have 90% of the uptake. And so it's not worth worrying about. If rain comes at a sooner time than 8 hours, then it's really a difficult decision. If it's within an hour, you probably got less than 50%, and I say retreat with half the dose that you did before. If it's 4 hours later, then I don't know what you do. Because you do lose some of the effectiveness if rain comes within, well, if it's just a very light drizzle, that's nothing. But if it's going to wash off, then you do lose effectiveness if you don't have at least 8 hours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Certainly something we'll be keeping in mind over the next few days if those pop-up showers do end up coming.
Okay.
So I'll just give us another minute in case anybody has any additional lingering questions. Just go ahead and you can type them into the chat box, or you can take yourself off mute and ask directly. Well, not seeing any, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank Terrence for his recommendations. Just a note that we'll be getting all of his recommendations out in an email probably within the next day or so. So keep an eye out for that. And we will be having our final meeting for the 18mm rescue probably sometime late next week. We'll announce that date as we get closer to it. Hopefully before then, we'll be able to get 2 more measurements in on our Honeycrisp plot down in Saratoga County so we can see how our 12mm spray panned out for us. So thank you all for joining us and good luck this week.